Okay, thanks, Jerry. I'm encouraged to see that I have a very small audience today. I would have been bothered had we had 75 or 100 people sitting out there, because this presentation is really directed to a select few, and that would be people in the construction business that don't have a very extensive work zone background at this point. So let me just ask, how many of you folks out there are contractors or have something to do with delivering construction projects out on the highway? How many of you are in that area? Okay, a few of you. How many people out here would be willing to raise their hand and say that they're a novice at work zone traffic control? They don't know much about it at this point. Okay, we got a few guys out there then that are really the people I'm trying to get to with this presentation. So hopefully I'll give you some good information that you'll be able to use. We're going to try to move through this quickly. We're getting started a little bit late. Okay, here we go. So the first thing we need to do is define what we're talking about by temporary traffic control. The acronym that we see is TTC. This is a term that comes out of the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, and it's probably not the term that most of us use in our daily language, and we'll look at some of those other terms in just a second. But the basic definition is that temporary traffic control is the use of temporary traffic control devices, and we'll define those in a minute, flaggers, police officers, and other safety devices and features to guide traffic through an area of a highway where the road user conditions are changed because of road work or an incident, such as an emergency or a planned event of some kind. Some of the other common terminology that we run into, and I think one of the problems we have in the highway safety business is that sometimes we don't speak the same language, or we don't understand what the terms are that somebody else is using, and we get confused about what we're really talking about. So the first thing we need to understand if we're going to be working in the work zone business is what the common terminology is. TTC is the technical term that's in the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, temporary traffic control. And TTCZ, or temporary traffic control zone, is simply that area of the highway that's affected by temporary traffic control. Probably a more common term, and what most people use in the daily language, is a work zone, or WZ. That, I think, what is much more common, but it means essentially the same thing as a temporary traffic control zone. A work zone traffic control, again, is the same definition basically as the TTCZ. A temporary traffic control plan are all of those activities and action strategies that are used to control traffic through this temporary traffic control zone. TTCD is a temporary traffic control device. These are all the devices we use out there in the work zone or temporary traffic control zone to try to get the traffic and pedestrians safely and expeditiously through the zone. And this would include channelizing devices and temporary signs and electronic devices and all kinds of other measures that are used. We'll look at some of those in a minute as well. There are other terms that are used in some states that mean about the same thing, but you may hear them depending on what state you're from or what language you're used to. So speaking in work zones, my former state, we called it M&PT, Maintenance and Protection of Traffic. Another term that a lot of state agencies use is MOT, or Maintenance of Traffic. They all are basically referring to the same thing. So it's important to understand that, and when you hear somebody use a term that's a little different than what you're used to, you'll know what they're talking about. Work zone traffic control varies extensively. It can be very complex, such as this project where we're crossing traffic across the median. We've got temporary lanes in place. We've got barriers out there, and a whole bunch of other things for this large project that will be in place for probably several months. It may be somewhat more simple, such as this one, where we're adding lanes adjacent to an existing roadway, and we've got a bit of a shift in the travel lanes down in the background there. You can see them, and we've got a temporary barrier out there separating the travel space from the workspace. Work zones, in some cases, can be very basic, very simple, such as we see here. This is probably a maintenance activity of some type, where all we have is a few traffic cones. We have a shadow vehicle with an impact attenuator on it, protecting the crew, and there will be a few signs upstream. Basically, a pretty simple setup that would be the kind of thing that you might see when you're doing short-term activities that only last a few hours from moving in and out every day. Well, the biggest, I guess the most important question that we really have to address, and the thing you really need to know about work zone traffic control or temporary traffic control, is why should a contractor even care about all of this effort we're putting into temporary traffic control? There's really two very compelling reasons. First, because it's the right thing to do, and second, because it's profitable. Safety really is caring about people, and what our ultimate objective is that everybody gets to go home at the end of the day. That means that every laborer working on your project, every pedestrian that happens to be walking through, and every traveler that's using that highway and is on the way home from work or going to the mall or whatever, our real concern is that these people get through the day and get to go home at the end of the day and have dinner with their family. This is an example of what effect work zone traffic control, good work zone traffic control can have on making sure that everybody does get home at the end of the day. This is a shadow vehicle with an impact attenuator on the end of it. It was strategically placed at a work zone in my former agency. This was hit by a high-speed vehicle. It was pushed over the side of the road. We noticed there's an ambulance there. There were some minor injuries, but everybody got to go home at the end of the day. Had this work zone not been set up properly, and that vehicle had gone barreling through and into the activity area, into the workspace where the workers were out doing patching, I think they were doing a joint sealing operation, we would have had probably 3 or 4 fatalities. So this is why good work on traffic control is so critical. Safety is also profitability. Any contractors out there that don't think they're paying enough money for liability insurance and workers' compensation, I don't think so. We all know that that's a huge part of your bottom line. Insurance costs really drive what you have to bid on projects in a lot of cases. Safety also affects your productivity and constructability. If your time and effort is all spent in trying to get your work vehicle in, try to get your deliveries into your work zone or into your activity area and so on, if you're limited in how many hours a day you can work, your constructability and your productivity are really going to suffer. So safety affects that as well. We heard several comments from speakers this morning about mobility. Safety affects traffic. In addition to mobility, it affects the overall safety. And again, it's critical to getting that traffic safely through our projects. And of course, liability, another big issue, the liability insurance that you have to carry, making sure that when something goes wrong, that you don't have to pay out huge settlements. Looking at a scene like this, which is the aftermath of a serious traffic accident, or a serious crash in a highway work zone, doesn't take much to figure the kinds of costs we could be thinking in terms of here, in terms of lost productivity. It may be several days before you get back to work. You may have had fatalities involved. You've had property losses here. This is going to cost somebody a huge amount of money. How serious is the work zone problem? What are we talking about in terms of cost on an annual basis? We saw in 2007 837 work zone fatalities, traffic fatalities in work zones in this country. That's down from what it had been running. That was the first time in several years that it had dropped below 1,000. So we're making progress, but I think we all agree that 835 is still way too many fatalities. Estimates of the annual cost range something over $4 billion per year what these accident costs are in our work zones. And something on the order of 75 workers are killed in vehicle and equipment accidents in our work zones. We heard some figures yesterday, over 100 worker fatalities in highway construction, and that is a good number, but that includes such things as fall accidents, excavation collapses, and things of that type. But the best estimate we would have of workers killed by vehicle accidents or backed over by construction equipment and so on, something in the range of 75 to 80. It's way too many workers, and certainly I think we would all agree that that's also unacceptable. What are the basic objectives of temporary traffic control? Well, there are really 3 things we're trying to address. Safety, which is protecting both road users and our workers. Mobility, which is getting traffic through, minimizing the congestion, and also giving us access to our work activities, and constructability itself, completing the project on time, within budget, and meeting the quality standards. These are obviously competing objectives, and a successful project requires that we have a successful balance between the three objectives. If we look at it this way, with this safety triangle, and we're really concerned about getting a good balance here. We'd like to be somewhere in the middle. If we move too close to mobility, over here we're getting further away from safety and constructability. We favor constructability, we're giving up safety and mobility and so on. So what we really want to do is be somewhere here in the middle. We've got a good balance between all three. Good traffic control, temporary traffic control achieves multiple objectives. We're getting good movement of vehicles, bicycles, and pedestrians. They're all on our projects. We need to accommodate all of them. We may have to accommodate transit operations. We need to provide access to adjacent properties and to utilities. We need to protect our workers and work operations. And we should be addressing efficient completion of the work, hopefully on time and within budget. So the bottom line is that reasonably safe and efficient movement of road users results while protecting the workers and completing the work efficiently. Who are the roadway users that I keep talking about? There are three main categories plus a critical subcategory of road users that we need to address. Motorists, these are people in motorized vehicles, passenger cars and pickup trucks and SUVs and larger trucks and buses and so on, but also bicyclists and pedestrians on most projects also must be accommodated. And pedestrians includes, as we heard in the previous session, persons with disabilities. And in addition to this, we also have to accommodate adjacent properties that have access to the roadway so that their business and their access is not disrupted. This is an example, unfortunately, of what very often happens. Here's our pedestrian out there in the middle of the street, try to figure out where he's going. And if we look at the garage there on the side, it doesn't appear to be any access to that. It's just a real mess out there in terms of accommodating pedestrians and roadside property owners and so on. The MUTCD lists a number of fundamental principles that should be accommodated or should be considered in work zones. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through these in detail, but just be aware that these fundamental principles are right at the introductory portion of the MUTCD. We'll talk about that in a minute, a little more detail. But these are the fundamental principles that you need to be aware of, need to consider in your work zone operations. It has to be an essential part of the highway work. It's not just something that you tack on. It has to be an essential part of the overall project. We want to minimize the restrictions on road user movements. The easier it is for a driver to get through the project, the happier everybody will be. We need to provide them with clear and positive guidance so they know what's expected and where they're supposed to be. We need to do routine day and night inspections. If the traffic control is out there at night, we need to look at it at night to make sure it's functioning. We need to address worker training to make sure every worker involved knows what they're supposed to be doing and how to do it. We need to maintain good public relations. The temporary traffic control needs to be in place before the work starts and removed when it's no longer needed. And finally, we have to have legal authority for the work zone actions that we're taking. Temporary traffic control standards and guidance. Where do we find this information that you're going to need? Well, there's several key sources that are listed on this slide. The MUTCD being right at the very top of the list. That's the Bible. But there's lots of other places that good, solid information is available, particularly if it's a federal aid project. There are several federal regulations that apply, subpart J and subpart K, or part 634 for worker visibility and so on. So there's lots of information out there, and this will be up on the website so you can copy these down later if you need them. Let's talk just a little bit about the federal MUTCD. What's in that, as I mentioned, that's really the Bible. That's the basics that we start with for temporary traffic control. This is the national standard for all traffic control devices, not just temporary, but all traffic control devices on any street, highway, or bike trail open to public travel. And now, the past year or so, this applies to any private property that's open to the public for travel. So if it's a park facility or something like Disney World over here, this private property, any place that's open to public travel has to be in compliance with the MUTCD. Each state has to be in substantial compliance, and nearly all of the states now have adopted the federal MUTCD, although there are still a handful of states that do have their own manual that's consistent with the federal manual. The part that addresses temporary traffic control is Part 6 of the MUTCD. That addresses temporary traffic control, and that includes information on the temporary traffic control devices, the signs and signalizing devices, and all of the others. And it also includes 46 typical application diagrams, and it also has a chapter on incident areas, traffic incident areas. These would be emergencies, traffic accidents, fires, and planned events such as parades or something of that type are also addressed there. Let's talk about some basic definitions. And this slide isn't as clear as I would have liked it, so I'll point out some things to you. Basic areas, there are 4 basic areas in the work zone. We start out with the advanced warning area, where we tell the driver what's coming, what to expect, and what they're going to need to do. Then we go into the transition area. This is where we change the normal traffic flow. It may be a lane closure, it may be a median crossover, it may be simply slowing traffic speeds. Then we get into the activity area. This is where the work actually occurs, and this is broken up into several parts. We have the workspace, that's the crosshatched area. That's where the workers and equipment and materials are. That's where the action is really happening. We have the traffic space. That's where we want the traffic to be moving. And then we have we may have 2 buffer spaces. This is a longitudinal buffer space. This is just a clear area where if a driver messes up, they don't get into the proper lane, we get some additional area to get stopped. And we also may have a lateral buffer space. It's just a lateral distance here between the workspace and the traffic space. So if a driver gets moving a little bit too far one way or the other in their lane, they've got a few extra feet there before they get into the workspace. And then finally, at the end of it, we get into the termination area, where we put traffic back into its normal location, normal pattern. Let's talk a little bit about temporary traffic control devices. I mentioned that earlier and said we'll get into it in a little bit more detail. This is a list of the most common ones that you would be using or encountering in a work zone. Signs, of course, we're used to. Portable changeable message signs, electronic signs. Arrow panels are commonly used for lane closures, for example. Channelizing devices, that includes drum, cones, Type 2 barricades, Type 3 barricades, all of those. Pavement markings are an important part of our temporary traffic control devices. Lighting devices, the flashing warning lights that are seen in some states commonly on barricades. And other devices also commonly used, but while they're not truly temporary traffic control devices, they are important safety features in work zones and are also commonly used. These would include temporary traffic barriers, crash cushions, impact attenuators on work vehicles, things of that type. I mentioned previously typical applications or typical application diagrams. These are an important part of the information that's in the MUTCD, and typically would be one of the things you would be referring to figure out how to set up a work zone. Typical applications illustrate traffic control approaches for a variety of common work zone situations. They're, however, illustrative examples that are not standards. You're not mandated to adhere to them, but they give you illustrative examples of how to approach various work zone situations. These typical applications need to be altered to fit the actual situation. You don't just pull them out of the book and plop them down out on the highway and expect they're going to solve all your problems. The MUTCD includes 46 typical applications, and these can be adapted, combined, and so on to address other situations not covered by those 46. This is a look at a very simple one. This is on a 2-lane, probably low-volume roadway where we're working on the shoulder, and all we're seeing here is a few signs and a work vehicle with the impact attenuator on the end of it. Compare that to something for a very complex work zone where we have a median crossover and we have lots and lots of signing, lots of other devices out there, and the typical applications can range anywhere in between those. So it just depends on the situation where you're working as to how complex it's going to be. traffic control plans, and now more properly, traffic management plans are an important part of what we do on a particular project. Typical applications are a starting point for developing a traffic control plan, but it's not everything that we need. The typical application simply shows us the devices that we're going to be applying out there, where traffic control plans will include a lot of other issues that are not necessarily addressed in the typical application. This would be things like work hours, closures, when you're permitted to close a roadway, detours and detour routes, and lots of other things that might be involved in managing traffic on a project. The contract plans and specifications for a project typically provide additional details that you're going to need to figure out how to actually carry out and successfully manage the work zone on a particular project. Most agencies now are providing standard details for temporary traffic control setups, which are in effect state versions of typical applications. So know what your state highway agency has available, where to get those, because you would be using those or referring to those for the specific setups that you would have on a particular project. Your contract plans also often include additional detailed drawings and so on, staging plans and things of that type that you would need to consider to get the proper traffic control on your project. Let's talk for just a minute about some common work zone myths, and there are lots of them out there. We've heard a few of them mentioned already at this conference, that things that sometimes people believe, and they really are convinced that these things are factual, but they're not always the best information that's available. And the first myth we have is that workers are at the greatest risk in our work zones. Well, that's simply not the case. If we look at the numbers, about 75 traffic fatalities to workers in a given year out of 800 and some total fatalities in 2007. So it's something on the order of 10% of the fatalities out there are workers. So it's not the workers that are at the greatest risk, it's the traveling public, the road users, that are experiencing the most fatalities. Work zone intrusions are a big problem. This is a myth for two reasons. Number one, there's no such thing as a work zone intrusion. If you think back to that diagram I showed, where we're really concerned about intrusions is the workspace. We don't want vehicles coming into the area where the workers are present. The work zone is the entire section of highway from the first sign to the last sign, or even back beyond that if there's a backup. So obviously every vehicle that drives through the project, that constitutes a work zone intrusion. What we're really concerned about is workspace intrusions. Workspace intrusions are very dangerous, but fortunately they are not an extremely common event. The best numbers that we can come up with are that we're experiencing perhaps something on the order of 24 worker fatalities each year in this country from workspace intrusions. That's certainly 24 too many, but when you consider that next to the 835 total fatalities we're experiencing, it's just one piece of the puzzle, so we need to focus on the bigger picture, not just that one thing. Another myth, excessive speed is our biggest problem. If you heard the speaker from Michigan this morning, hopefully that gives you a little different perspective on it. It's not just speed in absolute terms, it's appropriate management of speed that I think is really the issue, in having appropriate speeds in our work zones. Another big myth is the drivers are the enemy. No, they're not the enemy. They're our ultimate customer. If we didn't have drivers, none of us would be here today, because we wouldn't have this any of this business to deal with. So drivers are not the enemy. They're our customer, and we need to think of it in those terms. And finally, the biggest myth of all perhaps is that we can't control work zone safety. It's out of control. There's not much we can do about it. That's simply not the case, and that scene, again, the gentleman from Michigan this morning mentioned the big decreases they're seeing in work zone crashes and work zone fatalities in their state, and a number of other states have been able to accomplish similar things. There's a lot we can do if we use the information we have and implement it properly. Unfortunately, this is still what we're seeing in some cases. This is the approach to work zone safety on some projects, and the flagger sitting there doing whatever else he's doing. He's the sum total of our effort on work zone traffic control on this project. And if that's our approach, we're obviously not going to get much done. It's essential that everybody involved in the project, from top management right down through the individual workers, has to have specific responsibilities, has to have those responsibilities spelled out, and has to have adequate training that they know what they're supposed to do and how to do it. If you're a contractor manager for anywhere from a small company to a large construction company, it's absolutely essential that you have these roles spelled out and that everybody knows what they're supposed to do and has all the training and all the information available for them to do it. Contractor planning is another key part of successful work zone traffic control. You need to do basic things such as planning your staffing crew, your work crew, having adequate staffing out there so when it comes time to set up a lane closure, you can get it done quickly and get it into place with minimum interference and minimum loss of productive time. The same thing at the end of the day to get it out of the way, to get traffic open back up, and to have available staff out there so that when the devices get knocked down, if a sign gets blown over, whatever else, you've got staff there to take care of it. You don't have to pull somebody off another operation to get on and set up a sign that was just blown over. Because what's going to happen, given a choice between getting that concrete finished before it sets up and going down and fixing that sign that blew over there, you know which is going to win. You're going to finish the concrete. In the meantime, you're going to have an unsafe project because the sign isn't there. So adequate staffing is critical. Worker training, I already mentioned, critical. Everybody out there, not just the traffic control crew, but every worker on that project needs to know what their responsibilities are. If they see some unsafe condition out there, what should they do about it? Who should they report it to? Material availability is another important question. Getting your construction materials in, obviously, but also your traffic control materials, making sure that you have an adequate supply of signs, channelizing devices, and all the other things out there that are available when you need them. Project site control. A gentleman at the last session asked how many hours a day you need to dedicate to doing routine project inspections. The answer is as many as it takes. You've got to make sure that 24/7 that project is in good condition. If it's a very simple project, 1 or 2 drive-throughs per day may be adequate. If it's a large, complex project, you may need to have somebody on duty 24/7 constantly patrolling that project. Little things like overhead power lines, not directly a work zone safety issue, but if you're temporarily changing the location of the roadway, or if you've got construction equipment working under overhead power lines, you better make sure that they're marked and flagged because that can also be a deadly hazard. Emergencies and contingencies. What happens if an arrow panel at a lane closure fails? Do you have a replacement available that you can get it out there on quick notice? And finally, operational restrictions. Increasingly, in order to accommodate mobility needs, we're restricting the number of hours and the part of the day when a contractor can work. So you need to be aware of that and take that into consideration. Numerous other aspects of temporary traffic control that are important, and I'm going to finish up here because I think we're getting short on time, but just a few other things for you to think about. Participation is critical. You've either got to be in the game and be speaking up and stating what your needs are, what your concerns are, or they're not going to be heard. Lots of good information out there. Here's a number of helpful websites that are available. Again, this presentation will be posted after the meeting, so you'll be able to go back in and get these, but there's lots and lots of good information out there. If you're a good-sized company, you should have a safety director, and that person should be familiar with all of this stuff and know what's there and what's available. Do questions now, or do you want to wait to the end? Or? Okay.